The story begins with the ordinary, mundane feeling of waking up to an everyday problem. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when I received a letter from the Homeowners Association HOA. It was the kind of letter you usually brush off, assuming it's a reminder about community meetings or an update on neighborhood policies. But this time, the letter was anything but trivial. It contained a clear warning. My truck, parked in the designated area outside my house for the past few years, was deemed to be in an unauthorized space according to the latest HOA parking regulations. I had 24 hours to move it, or they would tow it. At first, I thought it was a mistake. My truck had been parked in that spot for as long as I could remember. I had never received any warnings before, nor had any neighbors expressed concerns about the parking. I immediately went outside to inspect my truck to find out if perhaps I had missed a sign or a change in parking rules. But no, nothing had changed, and the truck was parked as it always had been, within the lines of the parking space. I thought maybe the HOA had updated their rules without informing residents. But then, I realized this wasn't just a random oversight. Something bigger was at play. I stood there, feeling more and more frustrated. I noticed several of my neighbors' cars parked in the same area, but none of them had received similar letters. It felt like the HOA was singling me out for some reason. Was it a coincidence, or was I being targeted? I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about a parking violation. The HOA's strict, overbearing behavior had become a topic of conversation among neighbors lately. They had started cracking down on minor issues, implementing fines for things that used to be considered trivial. I had already seen the tension building in the neighborhood. People were growing frustrated, but no one seemed to have the guts to speak up. It was clear to me now that this wasn't just a simple violation. It was a battle for control, and I had become an unwilling participant. I had never been one to back down from a challenge, but this felt different. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules anymore. They were making money off of people's missteps. Tow trucks, fines, and threats had become their new business model. In that moment, I made a decision. This was no longer just about moving my truck. This was about standing up against the growing power of the HOA. I wasn't going to sit by and let them control my life, and I wasn't going to let them push me around like everyone else. If the HOA thought they could intimidate me, they had another thing coming. The days following the initial letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA, were filled with frustration and confusion, but they also sparked something within me. I wasn't about to let a petty parking violation ruin my day, or my entire experience in the neighborhood. I spent countless hours researching the HOA's powers and their connections with the neighborhood's rules. What I discovered was both shocking and infuriating. The HOA, it turned out, didn't just have control over parking regulations. It also had financial ties with the local tow lot. This wasn't something that had ever crossed my mind before. I had always assumed that the HOA's role was limited to maintaining the aesthetics of the community, ensuring everyone kept their lawns trimmed, and enforcing minor rules like keeping vehicles in designated areas. But as I dug deeper, I began to realize that this was a far more lucrative business than I had ever imagined. The HOA had been sending vehicles to this tow lot for years, and in return, the towing company and the HOA had developed a symbiotic relationship. Every time a vehicle was towed, whether for a minor violation like improper parking or a more serious issue, the owner had to pay hefty fines to retrieve their vehicle. It wasn't just about keeping the neighborhood neat anymore. It was about turning a profit. It was about controlling the residents and using their mistakes, however small, to generate money. The more I thought about it, the more disgusted I became. It was a classic case of exploitation. The HOA wasn't just an overseer of rules and regulations. It was essentially running a tow and fine operation where people were penalized for the smallest infractions, only to see their vehicles impounded at a lot the HOA controlled. I was outraged. It wasn't just my truck that had been towed. This was happening to other residents as well. I started to piece everything together. The HOA had been tightening its grip on the neighborhood for months, issuing warnings for trivial matters and issuing fines for things like improper lawn maintenance or minor parking violations. What made this all the worse was that the residents had no choice but to comply. If they didn't, their cars would be towed, and the fines were often so high that it felt like there was no way out. The more I delved into the details, the more it became clear to me that the HOA wasn't just trying to maintain the neighborhood. They were milking it for money, and I wasn't going to sit idly by and let them do it any longer. That's when the idea hit me. What if I could take control of the situation? What if I could purchase the tow lot? What if I could stop the HOA from using this business to further exploit the residents? It was a bold idea, but one that sparked a fire of defiance within me. The thought of taking the power away from the HOA and putting it back into the hands of the community was all I needed to set my plan in motion. The more I thought about it, the more determined I became. This was no longer just about my truck. It was about taking a stand against an organization that had become nothing more than a profit-driven machine. Taking action. Acquiring the tow lot, I immediately started looking into the ownership of the tow lot. I knew the HOA was heavily involved with the company, but I needed to understand who owned it and what it would take to buy it. After several calls, a few meetings, and countless hours of research, I learned that the lot was owned by a local businessman who had been operating the facility for years. I didn't know much about running a tow yard, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that I could gain control over this critical piece of the puzzle. Over the next few weeks, I reached out to the businessman who owned the tow lot. At first, he wasn't interested. He had been in the towing business for decades, and he didn't want to sell what he had worked so hard to build. But after some back-and-forth negotiations, I was able to make him an offer he couldn't refuse. I offered him a fair price for the lot, one that would allow him to walk away with a significant profit, while also giving me the ability to take control of the business that had long been the HOA's partner in crime. Once the deal was made, I officially became the owner of the tow lot. At first, it felt surreal. I had no experience running a tow yard, and the logistics of it all were overwhelming. But I didn't need to know every detail. What mattered was that I had gained control over the asset that had given the HOA the power to enforce their draconian rules. With the tow lot in my hands, I was now in a position to stop the HOA from towing residents' vehicles. And I wasn't about to stop there. I had bigger plans, and I was going to use my newfound power to make the HOA pay for their exploitation of the community. Reclaiming the vehicles. A plan in motion with the tow lot in my control, I knew I had to move quickly. The first step was to gather information on all the vehicles that had been towed by the HOA. I knew that the HOA had seized not only cars, but also several golf carts from elderly residents who needed them to get around the neighborhood. These carts weren't just vehicles. They were lifelines for people who were no longer able to drive long distances. The HOA had seized them for petty reasons: improper parking, no permit, or simply because the residents had parked in spots that the HOA deemed unapproved. I was appalled. These carts represented the community spirit, and here they were, being taken for the smallest of reasons. I wasn't just going to reclaim my truck. I was going to take back every vehicle the HOA had taken. I wasn't going to allow the HOA to destroy the sense of community that so many people relied on. I started by contacting the employees of the tow lot. I explained my plan to them and assured them that everything was legal. The employees were initially hesitant, unsure about getting involved with a new owner. But when I showed them the legal documents and explained the situation, they agreed to help. The first vehicle I set out to reclaim was a golf cart that had been seized from one of the elderly residents who lived down the street. It had been parked in a spot that the HOA deemed unauthorized, but it was clear to me that this was just another attempt to collect a fine. I went to the tow lot, showed my documents, and asked for the golf cart. It was surprisingly easy. Within minutes, I was behind the wheel, driving the golf cart back to its rightful owner's home. The look of surprise and gratitude on their face was priceless. They had never expected anyone to fight for them, but now, thanks to my intervention, they had their golf cart back. It wasn't just about returning a vehicle. It was about restoring a sense of dignity to someone who had been wronged. The joy on their face made it all worth it. Over the next few days, I went on to reclaim several more golf carts, carefully ensuring that each one was returned to its rightful owner. Word started spreading quickly, and soon, more and more residents were coming to me, asking if I could help them with their own issues. I was more than happy to oblige, and before I knew it, I had started a small movement against the HOA. My simple actions had sparked a sense of empowerment in the neighborhood. People were no longer afraid to challenge the HOA. They were no longer afraid to stand up for their rights. And for the first time in years, it felt like the community was starting to fight back. The final confrontation, a showdown with the HOA the day I went to reclaim my truck, was the turning point in this battle. By then, I had already returned several vehicles to their owners, and I had earned the respect of many residents. The HOA, however, was not pleased with what was happening. They had tried to intimidate me, threaten me, and bully me into submission, but they had underestimated my determination. I wasn't about to let them win. I made my way to the tow lot, where my truck had been sitting for days, waiting for me to pick it up. But this time, it wasn't just about retrieving my vehicle. It was about making a statement. I walked into the tow lot with a sense of purpose, knowing that this was my moment. The HOA's representative was sitting behind the desk, and when I handed over the legal documents showing that I was now the owner of the tow lot, his face went pale. He was stunned. He had no idea how to react. The very business that had allowed the HOA to exert its power was now under my control. There was no argument. The HOA couldn't touch me anymore. I wasn't just a resident who had been wronged. I was the one who had taken back control. The representative tried to argue, but it was futile. I had done my homework, and I was within my legal rights. I took my truck and drove it out of the tow lot, with a sense of triumph and satisfaction. I had won, and the HOA had lost. This marks the conclusion of the story. Through determination, careful planning, and a sense of justice, the protagonist not only reclaims their truck, but also takes down the HOA's abusive system of control. The entire community benefits from their efforts, and the HOA is left powerless. With the tow lot officially under my control, I knew the next step in my plan was crucial. I had not just bought a business. I had gained leverage to change the entire power dynamic in the neighborhood. The HOA had been systematically taking advantage of residents, and now it was time for me to turn the tables. But where to begin? The first thing I did was gather detailed records of all the vehicles the HOA had seized. I knew that most of the tows had been for minor, petty reasons, vehicles parked in the wrong spot, not displaying the proper parking permits, or even just a resident's failure to adhere to new, unexplained rules. The HOA's focus on trivial parking violations made me realize that this was not about keeping the neighborhood clean or enforcing meaningful rules. It was about making money off of people's mistakes. What made it worse was that the HOA and the tow lot were in bed together. The more they towed, the more money the HOA made. It was a cycle that was built on exploiting the residents, and I was done with it. After a few days of digging through the records, I began to understand the scope of the operation. I discovered that the HOA had seized several golf carts, which had been parked in the wrong spots or lacked permits, despite the fact that these carts were used primarily by elderly residents who had limited mobility. These were not just vehicles, they were essential tools that allowed these residents to get around, visit friends, and participate in the community. The HOA's disregard for their need was infuriating. I realized something. I couldn't just focus on my own truck. If I was truly going to make an impact, I needed to take back every vehicle the HOA had unjustly seized, and that included the golf carts. These weren't just objects. They were symbols of the community spirit. These residents had worked hard to live in a place where they could feel safe and independent, but now the HOA was making it impossible for them to maintain that independence. I wasn't about to stand by and let that happen. The process of returning the vehicles to their rightful owners wasn't going to be easy. Many of the carts were scattered throughout the tow lot, and it would take some time to locate them. But I was determined. I started by reaching out to the employees at the tow lot, explaining my plan to them. At first, they were reluctant. After all, they had been working for the HOA for years, and this was a significant change in the power structure. But I assured them that I was the new owner and that this was a legal, legitimate effort to return what had been wrongfully taken. Once they were on board, I got to work. The first golf cart I reclaimed was parked at the far end of the tow yard. It had been sitting there for weeks, collecting dust and rust. The elderly couple who owned it were devastated when it was taken from them. They were both in their late 70s, and walking long distances was no longer feasible for them. The golf cart allowed them to visit friends and run errands. Without it, they were stuck at home. The HOA had taken it for something as trivial as a no parking permit violation. It was maddening. I didn't waste any time. I drove the golf cart back to their house, carefully parking it in the same spot it had been before. The moment they saw it, their faces lit up with shock and joy. They hadn't expected to see it again, let alone have it returned to them in such a way. I explained who I was and why I was doing this, and they couldn't believe that someone had finally stepped in to help. For them, this was more than just getting a vehicle back. It was a sign that the community still cared. It was a moment that reminded me why I was doing this. It wasn't just about fighting back against the HOA. It was about restoring justice to the neighborhood. As word spread, more and more residents began to come to me with their own stories. Some had their vehicles towed because of a small infraction, while others had been charged absurdly high fines just to get their cars or golf carts back. I began making a list of all the vehicles the HOA had taken, including the golf carts and cars that had been impounded for the smallest of reasons.